Lecture 52, Daniel Defoe.
We return from Mexico and the work of Sor Juana de la Cruz to England and Daniel Defoe. This lecture will situate Defoe's best-known novel, Robinson Crusoe, which was published in 1719 within its larger early 18th century culture. In Robinson Crusoe, we see the tension between values associated with an aristocratic, hierarchically ordered universe on the one hand, and a culture that prized the individual agent capable of making his way in the market economy on the other. Robinson Crusoe is ostensibly a travel narrative, but it is also a story that is structured as a providential narrative, and thus embodies the values of the neoclassical world. Moreover, it is also a narrative of individual agency, and thus moves us closer to a modern understanding of the relationship between the individual and his fate. We will see how Robinson Crusoe's ingenuity in this brave new world of 18th century commercial enterprise brings him both great wealth and simultaneously great need of redemption. That is, Crusoe occupies a place between 17th century Puritanism and 18th century secularism. I want to begin by talking about the novel form itself before I turn to Defoe and the novel Robinson Crusoe. We begin with the novel, then. Charles Gildon, a political pamphleteer, described Defoe as a fabulous Proteus. Gildon's was just one of the many attacks upon Defoe for his willingness to work for both the Whigs, the Progressive Party, and the Tories, the Conservatives. The characterization of Defoe as a Protean politico, a shapeshifter, also describes Defoe, the novelist, one who could slip effortlessly into the persona of Robinson Crusoe, or the whore and thief, Moll Flanders, or the mistress to a king, Roxana. Perhaps it is precisely this ability to pass off the fictional as the real, to make us believe that Crusoe could have survived for 28 years all alone in an uninhabited island on the coast of America near the mouth of the great river Orinoco, that made Plato so suspicious of writers and poets, whom he would have banished from his utopian republic. The classical route to understanding our position in the material world and our relationship to the divine comes through philosophy, through the exercise of the rational and moral faculties, not through fantasy. The fantasy and escape offered in general by literature, and especially by the novel, was anathema to such disciplined pursuit of the truth that philosophy offered. Moreover, the novel was associated with the French, which is always anathema to the English, through the connection with the scandalous French romances and erotic narratives of the late 17th century, an aspect of the novel that Defoe reworked in his stories of women who were reformed prostitutes and thieves. So where did this hugely popular and therefore potentially anti-establishment form of narrative entertainment come from? What particular cultural circumstances promoted the success of writers like Defoe in the first quarter of the 18th century? Obviously, a very complex set of social and economic and political and religious reasons gave birth to the novel, but we can make some general statements to suggest how the novel became, by mid-19th century, the paradigmatic literary form of a nation and the Western world more generally. I'm going to suggest three general causes for the novel's popularity. 1, its novelty. 2, its representation of reality. And 3, its focus on the individual. First, the novel as the news. The success of the novel may be attributed in part to its ability to provide the audience with something they craved, something novel, something new. The last decade of the 17th century and the first 2 decades of the 18th century are marked by a voracious desire for news or for the new, a desire fueled by the forces of religious and scientific inquiry and the accompanying skepticism about received wisdom. Writers like Defoe, then, were responding to a demand for stories about what had just happened in a world much like the one they and their readers inhabited. Or alternatively, they wanted stories about what could be imagined as happening in a world that was not like theirs, but still of their time. stories about criminals, their remorse or lack of it before death, accounts of ghosts and hauntings, tales of scandal and erotic adventure, travelogues and autobiographical narratives, real or fictional, the consuming public couldn't get enough of them. Here is the editor of the highly successful journal, the Athenian Mercury, first published in 1691, and which solicited questions from its readers to be answered in print in its bi-weekly issues. He says, "We are all tainted with the Athenian itch. News and new things do the whole world bewitch." Just like reality TV today, one story bred 100 others, all imitating the conventions and form of the originals. And indeed, inspired by the enormous financial success of Robinson Crusoe, Defoe very quickly produced a sequel, The Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, which he published within a year of the original. 10 years later, he tried once again, unsuccessfully, to cash in on the success of his original with The Serious Reflections of Robinson Crusoe. And this was a failure. The second point about the novel's representation of the real. The same empiricism, that is, the reliance on the evidence of the senses, that defined the nature of scientific experimentation and philosophical inquiry, helps to explain the attraction of the novel at this time. A curiosity about the material world and an unwillingness to rely on received wisdom about causal relationships in the world of nature that was spreading throughout the scientific community finds its literary equivalent in a scrutiny that ordinary characters impose on the world around them. The details of everyday life are examined for clues about the fate of the protagonists. Natural phenomena are available as signs of moral and social success or failure. Reading the world is no longer a skill possessed by the few, but is claimed by even those who are illiterate, given that the signs are not restricted to the printed word. Reading is, of course, synonymous with interpretation. And this brings me to my third point about the novel, which is the agency of the individual. The claim of the individual to be able to read the text of the world means that in the novel there is an emphasis on the individual as the producer of meaning for the culture. There is a focus on how the individual, not the elite or the priest, but how the individual understands the relationship between the world and his religion. Such a focus has its origin in part in the Protestant claim that the individual needs no mediator between himself and God. What such an individual wants in literature is a representation of the values of his life rather than an expression of the values of a cultural elite. We can see how this is contesting the definition of literature according to the neoclassical perspective. So these three ways of defining the novel's generic qualities, a desire for novelty, a belief in empiricism as the preferred method for understanding everyday reality, and an emphasis on the individual as the producer and consumer of the culture, helped to explain why Defoe was so enormously successful. Moreover, Defoe's own career as a spy and a propagandist made him particularly suited to turning his powers of observation to the manners and values of the culture in which he had immersed himself. Employing the skills he had honed as a journalist, Defoe poured his accumulated understanding of English values, anxieties, and expectations into the tale of the shipwrecked adventurer and tradesman Robinson Crusoe. Defoe was the son of James and Anne Foe. Defoe later added the French prefix to his family name, and so despite his celebration of the English middle class, we see that Defoe was not himself immune to the idea of climbing the social ladder. He was born in 1660. His father was a city tradesman, a candle maker, and a member of the Butchers' Company, one of the craftsman guilds traditionally resistant to autocratic authority and progressive in politics. He was born in the year of the restoration of Charles II to the English throne, 1660, and Defoe would live to see Charles's son, James II, deposed from that throne. In fact, in 1689, Defoe rode to meet William of Orange, husband of James's daughter, Mary, when William landed in England to assume the English throne, thus guaranteeing a Protestant monarchy. Perhaps the most significant event in Defoe's early life was his family's decision to leave the Church of England to become dissenters or nonconformists, a move that would bar Defoe from attending university, holding public office, and subject him to both covert and overt repression for his religious beliefs. His education at the dissenter schools stressed the new science and philosophy, rather than the traditional Latin and Greek, and focused specifically on that branch of moral philosophy termed casuistry, the exploration of imagined moral and theological dilemmas. Such training would obviously come in very handy when he turned to writing novels. Despite his father's wishes that he become a nonconformist minister, Defoe turned to trade, but his risky business adventures forced him into bankruptcy in 1692. His efforts to pay off the debt led to further business failures, and he eventually turned to his pen to support his family. That business and trade were Defoe's real passion is evident from his remark later in life that writing on trade was the whore I really doted on. Defoe was amazingly prolific, producing over his lifetime more than 500 separate works, as well as several periodical series for which he wrote 2 or 3 essays a week. Defoe's adventures as a writer were just as notorious as his adventures in trade. In 1702, for example, he wrote a pamphlet called The Shortest Way with Dissenters, satirizing the extremism of fanatical Church of England Tories. Found guilty of libel, Defoe was sentenced to the pillory, where he was treated as a hero by Londoners, being pelted with flowers rather than rotten vegetables and stones. This incident is paradigmatic of Defoe's life. Using his pen to earn money, he would repeatedly find himself on the wrong side of a political debate, or forced into service with either the Tories or the Whigs, sometimes both at the same time. So it was not until 1719, when he was 59 years old, that Defoe found a way of making money that released him from this intricate balancing act, publishing the novel Robinson Crusoe. During his remaining years, Defoe wisely concentrated on novels rather than political pamphleteering. Robinson Crusoe is written in Defoe's plain style, which creates a vivid sense of the reality of Crusoe's island. And perhaps this explains why the book has been so popular as a children's book for so many years. This detailed verisimilitude is part of that view of the world that I have defined as empirical, that is, a belief in the value of the material world as a text by which we can understand that which is not material, using the visible and the concrete to explore the invisible, and in the case of Defoe, the spiritual. Robinson Crusoe, the novel. Robinson Crusoe is based upon Scottish sailor Alexander Selkirk's account of his 5 years on the island of Juan Fernandez. Defoe's narrative has assumed the proportions of a modern myth. Like Faust, Don Quixote, or Don Juan, Robinson Crusoe the man represents much more than his own story of shipwreck and survival. The novel was enormously popular. 80,000 copies were sold, and 4 editions were published between April and August 1790. 80,000 copies. That's a good print run even now, I think. And as I noted, Defoe immediately capitalized on his success by rushing another volume into print. Robinson Crusoe was translated into French and German, and by the end of the 19th century, over 700 editions and translations had appeared. According to French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Robinson Crusoe was the only book that afforded a complete treatise on natural education. Even today, the mere image of a solitary foot in the sand or the name Friday will conjure up Crusoe's narrative, most recently represented in the movie Castaway, which came out in the year 2000, where Crusoe is transformed into a world-traveling, troubleshooting FedEx manager. South African writer and Nobel Prize winner John Coetzee has also written a novel which spins off Defoe's original, and which he, interestingly, has titled Foe, Defoe's birth name. But of course it also means the other, the enemy. Despite its mythic quality, the story is emphatically English. The life and strange, surprising adventures of Robinson Crusoe marks a moment in the history of English literature when a true-born Englishman, to use the title of one of Defoe's pamphlets, represents something essential about the nation of his birth. Thoroughly English in its pragmatic Protestantism and its reliance on self, and in the ability of an island people to live apart from neighbouring communities. According to 20th century Irish mythmaker James Joyce, Robinson Crusoe is the English Ulysses. Joyce's characterization of Crusoe reminds us that, like Ulysses, Crusoe spends considerable time wandering in search of his fortune before he is shipwrecked on his island. In fact, the shipwreck is the immediate consequence of Crusoe's restlessness as a plantation owner in South America and his acceptance of an offer to engage in the slave trade. Crusoe's insatiable desire for the sea and for making a fortune is a mark of his inappropriate longing for a condition other than that middle state into which he has been born. For Defoe and his readers, the social organization of 18th century England has a design and order that reflects the design and order of God's universe. Crusoe's desire to free himself from his middle station is a sign that he has not accommodated himself to God's providence. The journeys that Crusoe undertakes and the adventures that befall him on the high seas are not just another version of the travel narratives popular in the 17th and 18th centuries, but an allegory of the spiritual journey of the soul, the story of the prodigal son who learns, in his 28 years alone on the island, to be content with his lot in life and the wisdom of his father's words, which express the quintessential contentment of the middle class with its lot in life. The middle station of life was calculated for all kinds of virtues and all kinds of enjoyments. The middle station is calculated to give peace and plenty, which are the handmaids of a middle fortune. Temperance, moderation, quietness, health, society, all agreeable diversions and all desirable pleasures were the blessings attended by the middle station of life. Crusoe learns both how to come to terms with God's plan after he has rejected the voice of providence, which had mercifully put me in the posture and station of life wherein I might have been happy and easy, and also he learns how to survive on his island, the island of despair, as he calls it, bereft of any of the comforts of his world, except some provisions, some ammunition, a carpenter's chest, which is more valuable than gold, and a Bible, which he has rescued from the shipwreck. One comes to understand Crusoe's individual struggle to make a home for himself on the island as essentially the same struggle that his soul must endure to make a home in the world under God's providence. Shaping his world, that is, building a shelter, raising crops and animals, protecting himself from threats, comes to be seen as synonymous with the way the individual shapes his world to conform to God's design. Crusoe learns as a social being how to remake his desolated and deserted island into a semblance of the familiar world, just as he learns as a religious being how to remake his faith in God. In this way, the reader understands how the economic and the religious, the secular and the spiritual, were intimately connected for Defoe's audience. Crusoe is a product of both the neoclassical world, with its belief in rational design and universal order, and the modern sensibility that insists upon the individual's capacity, both economically and spiritually, to move freely across social boundaries, to recreate himself, and this capacity obviously caused considerable anxiety among the upper class. Crusoe's struggle to understand his place in God's plan begins 9 months after his shipwreck, when he is taken ill, and in his fevered sleep he has a terrible dream. I thought that I was sitting on the ground on the outside of my wall, and that I saw a man descend from a great black cloud in a bright flame of fire and light upon the ground. He was all over as bright as flame, so that I could just bear to look towards him. His countenance was most inexpressibly dreadful, impossible for words to describe. When he stepped upon the ground with his feet, I thought the earth trembled, and all the air looked, to my apprehension, as if it had been filled with flashes of fire. He was no sooner landed upon the earth, but he moved forward towards me with a long spear or weapon in his hand to kill me. And when he came to rising ground at some distance, he spoke to me, or I heard a voice so terrible that it is impossible to express the terror of it, all I can say I understand was this: "Seeing all things have not brought thee to repentance, now thou shalt die." At which words I thought he lifted up his spear that was in his hand to kill me. Defoe's description of Crusoe's dream vision recalls the language of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and reminds us of the influence of Puritan doctrine and literature on Defoe's writing. Crusoe's reaction to his dream is to reflect upon the wickedness of his ways for the last 8 years as a seafaring man, which had erased all memory of his father's religious instruction. He speaks of the stupidity of his soul without desire of good or conscious of evil that overwhelmed him, and he suddenly understands how ignorant of God's designs he has been. Through all the variety of miseries that had to this day befallen me, I have never had so much as one thought of it being the hand of God, or that it was a just punishment for my sin. My rebellious behavior against my father, or my present sins which were great, or so much as a punishment for the general course of my wicked life. But I was merely thoughtless of a God or a providence, acted like a mere brute from the principles of nature, and by the dictates of common sense only, and indeed hardly that. When Crusoe speaks of acting like a mere brute, guided only by the principles of nature and the dictates of common sense, we should not confuse his description with that refined response to nature that we identify with the literature of neoclassicism and romanticism. Crusoe describes here the response of an unthinking, irrational creature, one who possesses only common, that is, uncultured sense, one who responds sensually rather than rationally to the world. The kind of creature that Jonathan Swift will portray in the yahoos who inhabit the 4th book of his satiric travel narrative, Gulliver's Travels. Overwhelmed with remorse, Crusoe recalls his father's warning that if he went to sea, if he rejected his place in God's order, he would suffer God's reproach. For the first time in many years, Crusoe prays to God, "Lord, be my help, for I am in great distress." Crusoe's description of himself as a mere brute foreshadows the most famous scene in Defoe's work, perhaps one of the most memorable moments in all of English literature, even for those who have never read the book: the discovery by Crusoe, now in the 15th year of his isolation, of a single footprint in the sand. "It happened one day about noon, going towards my boat. I was exceedingly surprised," he says, "with the print of a man's naked foot on the shore, which was very plain to be seen in the sand. I stood like one thunderstruck, or as if I had seen an apparition. I listened, I looked around me, I could hear nothing, nor see anything. I went up the shore and down the shore, but it was all one. I could see no other impression but that one." Crusoe's fear that the print might be the mark of Satan or indicate the presence of cannibals temporarily drives all trust in God's providence from his mind. But upon reflection, he finds his confidence in God restored, and he comes to understand that prayer is the act of a rational being, not the desperate plea of a frightened man. Praying to God, he says, is an act of the mind, not of the body. It is only after his faith has been tested by, ironically, the suggestion that he is not alone on the island, that Crusoe is able to pass that faith on to another. When he rescues Friday from the cannibals, he might be said to be rehearsing his own rescue from the state of mere animal lust and sensuality. Just as Crusoe has had to learn to honor both his heavenly and earthly father's wisdom, so Friday learns to become the perfect child to his father, Crusoe, who teaches him the perfection of God's design from his own experience, which he confesses has included his own savagery before he accepted God's providence. That providence naturally includes, for both Crusoe and Defoe's audience, the enslavement of the savage. Indeed, when Crusoe later saves an English captain and his crew from mutineers, he includes them in the design he has imposed upon the island. "My island was now peopled," he says, "and I thought myself very rich in subjects. And it was a merry reflection which I frequently made, how like a king I looked. First of all, the whole country was my own mere property, so that I had undoubted right of dominion, Secondly, my people were perfectly subjected. I was absolute lord and lawgiver. They all owed their lives to me. Crusoe's story, then, is the story of a man who gradually learns to master his own self, his world, and other men. As critic John Ricchetti puts it, Crusoe engages in higher and higher forms of mastery. First, he has to learn to master the self, then the environment, then animals, then natives, and the Europeans. As such, then, Crusoe's story is the story of the growing presence of England in the New World. It is a story of colonization. Robinson Crusoe is also a narrative about the power of human reason to overcome the natural world, to tame the natural world, and thus an embodiment, in one sense, of Enlightenment ideology. But of course, it is not the embodiment of that version of freedom from enslavement that Voltaire and Rousseau and Diderot would endorse. For all three philosophers, the concept that man could be enslaved, or even willingly enslave himself, was antithetical to their basic belief in the inalienable possession of liberty. Voltaire, in particular, draws attention to the enslavement of those who labor in the cotton and sugar plantations of French colonial possessions to provide Europeans with luxuries they have come to think of as necessities. For Rousseau, the concept of the noble savage serves as a foundational ideology in his representation of the corruptions wrought when men vie with each other for power. And Frida's cannibalism is one more example of that corruption. Thus, Crusoe's rescue of him from barbarity only to convert him to Christianity and enslave him would not be seen by Rousseau as an advance upon Frida's previous condition. And in his encyclopedia, Diderot illustrates the means of the production of cotton, with the labor of both black slaves and indentured Chinese servants, making quite clear to those who cared from where and with what labor their fashionable clothes were manufactured. When Crusoe is finally rescued and returns to England after a 35-year absence, he discovers that the money he made while a merchant trader and colonial planter and left in trust has grown, and he is now a very rich man. Thus, in good Puritan style, we see that spiritual wealth and material wealth conform, and especially now, since Crusoe has discovered God's providence. We also understand that, despite Crusoe's insistence that he should have stayed at home, like a solid middle-class citizen, the best and best-selling stories are most often about those who don't, like Robinson Crusoe, and the protagonists of Defoe's other novels of individual economic desire and God's providence, like Moll Flanders and Roxana.